So we move then to Xin Liu. Thank you. Go ahead, Xin.
Can you all see my presentation?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you, Nicholas, for the great opening. I'm so glad you're part of MIT now. We first met each other, I think, 5 years ago, 4 years ago. It's a wild summer, and welcome to Cambridge.
Thank you.
So in this presentation, I will take a more personal and technological approach on the topic of living Earth. My background is in engineering and art, so you can probably get a taste from this presentation. So when we first decided on the topic of living Earth, this is kind of the image came to my mind. A very photogenic moment of a SpaceX rocket piercing through the sky. But later, I went back to another moment in this installation by Ilya and Amelia Kabakov's work, The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment. Somehow in this time of global quarantine and confinement, this seems much more appropriate for talking and imagining about living Earth. And similarly, I want to use this presentation to invite everyone to join me and take a short trip from our respective apartments and live Earth. And in this journey, it will be vertical. So the concept of living Earth is essentially escaping Earth's gravity, and is often considered as a spiral path, as rockets or any kind of aircrafts accelerates and leaving the grasp of gravity along the line. However, before we reach to the escape velocity, we're still majority dealing with a rather vertical space, a thin layer just above the Earth's surface, atmosphere that is divided into 4 sections, and each of them has unique physical, political, and technological features. So today I'm going to take us through those different layers in our atmosphere. The first one is troposphere, is where we are. It contains 75 out of the atmosphere's mass, and it contains water, oxygen, it enables life. The temperature of this layer decreases with altitude, as we normally would imagine climbing the hill. And it's often where commercial flights would reach to also. And essentially, our daily life exists in this layer. The sweet spot of flying for airplane is also regarded at the 35,000 to 42,000 feet, because if it gets too high, the oxygen becomes too spare to fuel the engines, and if it's too low, we start to meet air resistance. And this area of troposphere is essentially the most regulated space. Here's an example in the United States that we can see that there are different class of the airspace, and New York City falls under Class B airspace, the third one in the image, because of JFK and LaGuardia airports. So basically, if you are living close to a massive, important nationwide airport, you cannot fly a drone without a permit. All aircrafts entering the Class B airspace must obtain air traffic control clearance in order to fly, and are required to equip with two-way radio transmission. And this is something I found particularly interesting as we talk about space policy. We look at the moment from the Earth and jumping into outer space. However, this process of getting there is actually much more complicated and really delicate dance between technological and political situations everyone are living through. So the two-way radio transmission I was mentioning is often the ADS-B system that essentially require anything that is flying except your private or military or secretive, that to broadcast your identification, your position, your attitude, your velocity constantly. And this information, it's essential for the infrastructure of airspace, but at the same time, it's semi-public. So some journey you're taking with me now, you can see that when I was back in Boston, maybe 3 years ago, we set up a software radio system in my balcony, and with this little antenna, we were able to actually receiving the air traffic information and be able to watch all this airplane coming in and out of Boston as a projected ceiling installation in our bedroom. And though maybe at this height, our daily experience is still rather earthbound, we can already simulate outer space-like experience with parabolic flight. Parabolic flight are aircrafts which can give its occupancy the sensation of weightlessness by following a parabolic flight path relatively to the center of the Earth. So in the initiative, Space Exploration Initiative in MIT, where I'm working at, ever since 2017, we have this ongoing annual parabolic flight mission for students to experience that. It sets a really high bar for the caliber of the projects. We have biology, we have architecture, we have body exercises. It's essentially a learning experience in doing research in this 20 seconds bursts of gravity, a microgravity, as the airplane essentially is just free falling from the sky. So this is myself, my exciting, funny face when I first experienced weightlessness in 2017. The sensation is really like losing a tether to the ground rather than floating or flying, which I was expecting. I experienced more a sensation of falling, which is revealing that gravity never disappears. There's no zero gravity per se. It is just everything falling together and the habit that we have living in reference to each other. So there's a very short video. We are not going to finish it, but to just give people a sense of how it looked like in the airplane. So a trick lots of time people do is that before you enter the entire weightlessness in the flight, you kind of jump. That gives you a little bit longer, maybe 1 second more time to fall. That makes you be able to be floating. I think that's juxtaposition of all this movement is quite exciting in the beginning, but then later on become a turning point in my own practice. I won't finish the video. The project is called Orbit Weaver. You can check it online if you're interested. So moving further, we enter stratosphere, where the warmer layer is higher and the cooler layer is closer to the Earth because of the sun's ultraviolet radiation. So closer to the sun, the warmer the air becomes. And that's also where the ozone is. As we all know, we nowadays have this agreement, international treaty to protect the ozone from the research by Mexican scientist Mario Molina and American scientist Roland warned about CFS impact on our ozone. And that's also where the starting point in atmosphere that you can see more and more international treaty play into the role of regulation, much more than the lower atmosphere that is still ground-bounded. It's separated based on nation edge. Here in a stratosphere, we have a much intense relationship and unregulated relationship in the air that require international treaty to be played and protect the atmosphere in separation of in separation of their ground location. Even though this layer seems to be higher, but it is on the contrary much more accessible in an interesting way to citizens. There is lots of high altitude bloom launch YouTube videos you can find online that in fact are much easier to achieve and get into this atmosphere and then be able to see even kind of the edge of space using a high altitude bloom. And of course, there has been development in tourism and entertainment industry to take use of that technology. But interestingly, looking here, that even though at this location, you able to see the edge of horizon, a quite unbeatable view, I have to admit, but it's actually not a witless experience. So it reminds us again that witless is all about falling into the gravity rather than be able to be lifted up no matter how high you are. And another very important project is Project Bloom by Google. It's a network of blooms that designed to bring internet connectivity to rural and remote communities worldwide. After Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017, Bloom launched its blooms there to be able to help with the local connectivity. However, due to the lack of regulation in stratosphere in an international level, at an international level around launching, which is very different compared to the airplane, we have to ask whether we can trust Google with this cheap, large amount unmanned aerial vehicles all over the globe. So keep going up. That's another, in a funny way, I think that's my favorite atmosphere, metrosphere. It is where we start to see lots of cosmic phenomena such as gravity waves, meteorites, and particularly the beautiful noctilucent clouds, which is essentially ice crystals that are reflecting lights from the sun. In this layer, we really reach to the general public understanding of outer space. And lots of the phenomena we consider in outer space are actually still within this layer of atmosphere. And speaking of meteorites, I would like to point at this Japanese company, ALE, who are creating shooting stars on demand. Their satellites will, according to their proposal, shoot especially engineered pellets that burns bright, colorful lights when it travels through the atmosphere. So you can imagine potentially they could work with Disney and to have some meteor shower in a special night in the theme park. And this is also where the question we just had a wonderful discussion with Nicholas about where the edge of space is. So in the aerospace domain, the general understanding of the edge of space is Karmaland, 100 kilometers above the Earth's mean sea level. There is a paper by Professor Jonathan McDowell from Harvard in 2018. It is perhaps a good starting point to revisit this definition of Karmaland and edge of space. He really go into details about the functional, cultural, physical, technological, mathematical, and historical factors about how we decide on the edge of space. Without going into too much details, there is a good example recently that Virgin Galactic, they have been, just like Blue Origin and SpaceX, has been pouring energy into the space traveler industry, and their flight get to this 82 kilometers level, which from certain physics perspective, and even in Jonathan's paper, they are considering it as a new definition of space, the edge of space. So which also means the people who would take the Virgin Galactic flights and enter there would become astronauts. And then that, of course, caused a lot of furious discussions from Blue Origin and SpaceX, who are not happy with it, as their flights could reach 100 kilometers. So their customers should be actually considered astronauts, not Virgin Galactic. So this is just a very typical example of the discussion in that kind of similar mathematical decisions, but result in economical like competition, I would say. And further moving forward, we are essentially getting into the real outer space. We consider the thermosphere, where the temperature increases entirely due to solar radiation, and we have ionosphere, which is crucial for satellite communication, and there's also International Space Station and Hubble Space Telescope are currently reside in. And that's typically how we'll get there through a rocket, like what I showed at the beginning. And my personal experience, or first personal experience with this atmosphere, was a project together with Blue Origin, where we took the New Shepard system. It is a suborbital flight, meaning it did not reach to orbit. It did not have a orbiting movement. It purely reached to Karmaland, and the capsule separate at the tip and had a free flight, which is essentially, again, free falling back to the Earth. And during that duration, the capsule experienced a 3-minute uninterrupted weightlessness. So in that flight, I participated and had a project which is called Living Distance. You can see it's a little mechanical robot that carried a wisdom tooth to space. So it is a fantasy and a mission, and result in a series of films I produced. And I want to highlight this moment when the robot was actually in space. As you can see, it was floating, probably above the Karmaland at that point. When people ask me about this project, I kind of like to reference a Chinese saying that when a kid loses her teeth, if it's a top tooth, we'll bury it under the ground, and if it's a bottom tooth, we will throw it up high to the ceiling. And that was a bottom wisdom tooth of mine. And this whole journey of the tooth was never meant to be going up and leaving Earth, but meant to reach to the height and had this very special weightless moment experience, and eventually falling back to the Earth. And recently, probably you can tell that I'm getting more and more interested in the falling rather than living in my work, as what I realized that's where the gravity really switched its relationship with us. There's also a lot of politics and fascinating facts I've been looking at. For example, here in Russia, that as a rocket going up, we can imagine that with the first, second stages burning, especially for solid fuel, that the rocket burned remains are just gonna fall back into the earth because they are not designed for recycle for any kind of early stage rockets. And then the path the rocket takes is often taking into always take into consideration that where the ruins of the rocket would also fall. And where it falls are often locations are generally rural and remote. There is also another movie from 2009 by Chinese director Zhang Zanbo called Falling from the Sky. It really in depth talk about or captured the villagers in China, a very remote area, how they kind of from the beginning, not even understanding what are the things are falling from the sky, thinking they are mythological objects, to the point they understand they are in fact rockets, and trying to recycle them and sell for a good price. So there's a whole arc of the development and the people's relationship with the falling rockets. Similarly, trash is often the problem in space exploration, as we are aware nowadays. This is a capture of space debris. And the reason we'll have that is, first of all, the recycling is tremendously complicated and much, much more expensive than just throwing objects out there. But also because that we have this understanding that beyond the karma line, in this familiar vision of outer space, we entering another terra nullius domain, which is saying that it's literally a vacuum home, a land of no man, that anyone could enter the space and without the agreement that it belongs. So meaning like space doesn't belong to anyone, basically. However, the treaty, the governing the activity in space exploration, is not purely meaning everything belongs to everybody, but the nation power is still existing, but they're often confined within the vessels. I found that quite interesting because we cannot, like we just talk about, as human beings, we cannot exist in space solely. We have to be, our lifeline have to be maintained within a rather complicated technical vessel, while at the same time we having this idea of free space that at the same time the nation power is also confined within the vessel. So all those dialogues are mixed together in a way. Nowadays we are looking at International Space Station, which recently we just had a project with them. It's called the Sojourner 2020. It's a first international open call for artworks in ISS. I was shocked to realize that we were actually the first one. And we, in the end, chose 9 group of artists from all over the world to be launched together into ISS. And in that process, it was remarkable because I, as a Chinese citizen working in United States university, it was a fascinating process to navigate hosting international open call in ISS, where Chinese astronauts are not actually allowed to be inside of. While at the same time, we're also experiencing the commercialization of ISS nowadays. So in 2017, NASA extended the contract. So now ISS essentially a U.S. national lab, and it is very much a commercial entity in transform that we will be able to see many private sectors being opened up and allowed to enter the International Space Station. And again, you can say more and more of this economical development in low Earth orbit, which is from where we come from, the apartment to this point, that all belong into this category, that how every single step going up forward, leaving Earth, is essentially a question about political and economical strengths, and with a twist of physics and technological advancement from different places. And I really found this image quite interesting. Is actually I about it from Nicholas' essay back in Efflux many years ago, that he mentioned that in his essay he mentioned that this image was taken in during the mission Apollo 17, the last moon landing mission, and it was actually almost the first real, most reproduced in history. However, is like the first image that was actually the Earth was the spacecraft was navigated and designed to find a good position to take a full and a beautiful Earth. And the question in comparison is like it actually has been almost 30 years before we were able to send a satellite to outer space till this picture was taken. And that's something quite interesting. Go back to Christopher's conversation about the production of images in this domain, that in the early time, due to the area that is very much military in Iran, that the cost of having a camera in a satellite was not justified to take a holistic image of the Earth. Most of the cases, they are only able to justify the cost of cameras that are focal points onto a particular part of the Earth due to surveillance use. So that was kind of interesting. Kind of going back, I just added this picture last minute before my talk started, just resonating with the conversation. And of course, at the same time, as we finally leave the low Earth orbit, we are now facing a big difficulty to finding a common ground for the Moon Treaty. Essentially, both China and United States are not happy to sign the treaty around the mining regulation on the moon, and we're still looking and not sure how this is going to play out in our journey leaving Earth. So to finishing up, this journey of leaving Earth again is a spiral path. In many ways, it reminds me of the Tower of Babylon. And I would like to share a short story from one of my favorite writer, Ian Chen. He wrote this short story about Tower of Babylon, in which the character Hilam, is a miner from the Earth. He and his colleague have been hired to dig through the vault of heaven, and as the job goes, he slowly climbed the Tower of Babylon and alone passes safely through the vault. After quite a journey ever upwards, he finds that he has finally dig through the heaven and emerge back at the surface some distance from the tower rather than in the heaven as he expected. And I would like to end my presentation here today. Thank you very much. Did I stop the sharing? Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Xin Liu. That was wonderful. Gabriel, do you want to direct for questions?
Sure. Were you speaking to me? Or were you
I was
speaking
thinking to Gabrielle, but go ahead if you have a question, please.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Xin. Thank you very much. Nice to see you, and thank you for Frank, for the presentation of the work. I'm quite taken by the way in which you describe your interest in gravity as a kind of obviously as a force, but as a kind of form-giving force, I suppose, is the way of kind of looking at it. I was reminded that the way in which you were describing this of everything, I think the way you put it, of everything falling together as this, not as a unique or exceptional state once you get to go up on the parabolic airplane, but rather sort of one of the things that you discover while you're there is that everything is always falling together. That gravity is always the thing that works in this way. I was reminded of Lucretius and the swerve, and sort of back to this very sort of ancient idea of things falling together, and the way in which form is given by this falling. And so I guess as opposed to thinking that it seems to me there's something in this to be explored in relationship to notions of ground, particularly within philosophy, and the way in which ground and groundedness is in different ways privileged as a kind of a condition of orientation. And a gravity and ground are obviously very different things. I suppose one way in which they work is that as opposed to thinking of as a sort of form is given, and gravity is a force that acts upon form. The implication of the direction in which you're pushing this is that inverse, is that gravity is that form, and that gravity is the force, and that form is the outcome. So sort of a bit remind then of Darcy Thompson, and form is a diagram of forces with this together. And so I guess the one thing is to invite you to talk a bit more about, since you mentioned this as some of the place in which your work was going, to invite you to talk a bit more about what you see as the implications and the horizon and questions that opens up. The second one, real quick, and if you only do the first one, that's fine as well. But the idea of terra nullius and the empty space, right? This was also this is a legal term that also comes from the colonial era of a definition of space that was available for occupation as if it was empty, but what wasn't empty in it itself. And your invocation of this at a moment in which we learn that the way in which ownership works in space is still tied to the country of origin of the debris. Like whatever the objects of whatever their country of origin, that they're somehow retain their citizenship, even as they float around the earth. That I wonder whether we'll look back on this moment as one in which, at the first point, we're moving off the surface and doing many more things, occupying space off the surface, and yet organizing how it is that we move off surface in relationship to the 16th and 17th century model of territorial jurisdiction, and that this will seem very, very strange to our descendants. So, in any event, so two things that I felt were very provocative for me in your presentation. Please.
Thank you. For the question about ground and horizon, actually, I would highly recommend this essay by Hito Stell. I think it just called In Free Fall. She kind of analyzing the idea of establish of a horizon, and from that point and talking about the necessity of a ground. And recently, I've been thinking a lot about that even more, as for me, rather than a philosophical inquiry in this topic, I see that more like a lived experience. In 2020 is kind of the year of losing grounds in many different ways. There's something interesting about that experience that is similarly coherent. That when I was in the parabolic flight, that I first of all realizing that the first experience actually the ground living view, and it was, instead of liberating, it's rather terrifying. And then slowly it once you accept it, it becomes quite liberating, but not in the way like a Superman, but in a way of giving up certain assumptions, which I think is something I'm trying to project back in my time right now living in my apartment for 5 months and constantly reminding myself about that experience. And there is a little quote from Hitchell's writing, and I think probably summarize it in a philosophical way better than what I could ever put it. So I would like to share with everyone. So she writes that a fall towards objects without reservation, embracing a world of forces and matters which lacks any original stability and sparks the sudden shock of the open, a freedom that is terrifying, utterly deterritorializing, and always already unknown. Falling means ruin and demise, as well as love and abandon, passion and surrender, decline and catastrophe. Falling is corruption as well as liberation, a condition that turns people into saints and vice versa. It takes place in an opening we should embrace, indulge or enjoy, embrace or suffer, or simply accept as reality. So in a way, I think, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's how I related to it. And as to the concept of land of no man, terra nullius, it is, I don't think it is surprising even that we're going back to the almost Columbus time when we're referring to the new territory. As we're looking at space exploration, at least in the mainstream, the narrative has never really changed. The idea of Mars colony, the use of words and the concept of expanding is repeating itself and never really find a new dialogue merging in a larger scale. However, but I'm more interested in the almost how to say, not funny, but the paradox about how that definition itself is settled on the idea of space belong to all humanity, the rather optimistic liberal concept, while at the same time I think one of the main goals I want to illustrate in this presentation is the path to get there is extensively political and economical and technically intertwined. So if there is a so-called free space, but there's no accessibility towards that, I found that rather unnecessary to even talk about whether that land on the other side is defined as it is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. We have one question perhaps that we can go through. Adam Elstein.
Unmute myself. Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you for a really beautiful presentation. First of all, I love the Kabakov project that you presented. I saw that years ago, actually at the Roundhouse in London, and it always really struck me. And I'm glad you started with that. I just was thinking, in general, if you could reflect if you want to reflect at all, on the relationship between weightlessness and capital. And the reason I'm saying this is because on one hand, you have Kabakov's project where the man projects himself into space, which is an act of the imagination. On the other, all of the actual experiences of weightlessness that you're actually really analyzing are very much dependent on access to this magical fluid, which is capital, which brings weightlessness in a way. And in a sense, we're those who don't have access to this magical fluid are to a sense sort of bound to the earth. So there are maybe some political dimensions to access to weightlessness. So I just wanted to put it out there to see if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And even more extreme cases would be like in the film that not only the villagers could not reach to space, they are also taking on the damage, the ruins, the fallings of the journey. I think that's something, as working in this domain is always a difficult navigation in terms of like how we're looking at our approach, in a way that I've been working in MIT this initiative for about 4 or 5 years. We can take different approach. However, our decision is there are accessibility and limits of accessibilities, and within that institution, as individual, I'm interested in how can I open or find cracks in that system to allow accessibility. So, for example, like the project I quickly mentioned, and also other projects I mentioned, that if you see a project of mine, there are gonna be probably 6 other projects on the same flight, but I was not able to share all the different projects. That there's at least 2 aspects we're looking at. One is the disciplines of the projects. So the support of anything that is beyond rocket science or traditional aerospace discipline is one of our focus. And the other thing is generally artists and practitioners who are not connected with prestigious institutions such as MIT, that we use the open call, as I mentioned, as a way to allow access. I do believe that in fighting against this limits and accessibility, there is a path that you have to find cracks and letting the energies to leak through the system. This project, like the open call, was never really a ISS open call. It was technically, this is an interesting process I like to share. I proposed a scientific experiment of a 3-layer structure that simulate different kind of gravity within that system because they rotate. So it creates central forces to simulate gravity in the moon, on the Mars, and zero gravity. So as a scientific project, I designed it as a space habitat, but using that as a way to open the habitats within my projects to different artists and everywhere in the world to join in the work. So that was, you can see the pipeline of how the little cracks open again. It is a complicated process, and I think we need to do more of that.
Thank you very much for that, Xin. I think we can move to our next presentation. Chris, would you like to have any remarks just to...
Please go ahead, Ben. Good to have you. Thank you, Xin Liu. Thank you very much. That was. I wish we could go on more with that discussion. That was really rich. But
Yes,
we will.
someday when we go forward. Thank you. Thank you very much.